Some of you know that I collect manger scenes. And I have them from all over the world, and they continue to grow in that collection. But nowhere in any of those does John the Baptist show up. And yet, in 2 weeks, we spent time talking about John the Baptist. Nowhere in this scene does King Herod show up, and yet Herod plays a really important role. Because if we put the Magi in, we need a place for Herod, too. Now I want to talk a little bit about what all of this might mean for us in our own time and place. But it seems odd, right? At the end of the Christmas season, the last time where we celebrate the return of the showing up of the Magi, the gifts. And throughout the ages, people have tried to understand why these three gifts, and they spent all of this time and energy on these three gifts. Were they precursors to Jesus' death and resurrection? Were they signs that kings had come to bring gifts to another king? And it's fascinating because none of that really gets at the heart of what's going on. It helps us ignore the reality of Herod. And if we ignore the reality of Herod, the children who died in Bethlehem in and around under the age of 2 can go by the wayside. So in order to get to what I think is the essence of the story, we need to spend some time kind of clarifying things that you know, but it's always important to remind you. I made a mistake as I was reading along with the English editors of the book, and they turned the title into Wise Men. Well, some of you might have read a couple of years ago, for those who have seen it, one of the Presbyterian Women's Horizons Bible study was written by a New Testament scholar by the name of Margaret Amer Auger. And she is quite a spitfire and is at Austin Seminary now, and I appreciate her work a whole lot. Earlier this week, she talked about those who were preparing to preach ought to remember that the word there is magioi. Now, why is that important? And you know I don't do a lot of Greek work from the pulpit, but it's important to know that in no way and under no circumstances were this group of people kings. We will sing We Three Kings. I love the song, so I'm not going to pick on it. But they were not kings who had come. There's no evidence either that there were 3 of them. Again, I know the song says We Three Kings, and I'm always glad to sing it. But the other part that she wanted to mention to us is that the truth is we're not even sure they were all male. In fact, the Magioi were folks who were star readers, shaman, other kinds of weird folk, and women were part of their ranks. We know that to be true. So it's possible, and why that Greek word, I know I'm getting down in the weeds here, but she wanted to point this out, and so I'm going to share it, because she did. There's no evidence, this is what she said, that there were 3, and to be masculine plural, which is what the Greek is, only one of the people in the group had to be male. That's how the patriarchy worked, right? Well, we used to say men to represent everybody. Of course we meant to mean everybody. So here's this group of folks who were outside the mainstream. But they were attentive to the ways in which the divine was at work in the world. I say it that way because these were not followers of the God of Israel. These were outsiders from the East. The folks who you didn't want to listen to, but you knew that they knew something you didn't, so you better. And they saw the star at its rising, and they knew the king had come. And so, lo and behold, they come to the king of Israel, the current king, right? And they want to ask him about the new king. Now, King Herod, as we all know well, was not a nice guy. He actually killed off a lot of folks. He executed anybody who he thought was a perceived threat. He killed a high priest at one point, and he also killed his wife. Lovely guy. He understood that to maintain power, he had to make sure that all threats were disposed of. And so by the time he gets to little children in a village that no one knows about, he's not going to lose any sleep at home. There are interesting actors through all of this, right? Everybody has a role to play. And one of those folks who show up are the religious leaders, which the first time in the Christmas story that they show up is here. The king summons them and they come. And what's clear is Herod was one of those kind of rulers that used the people's religion against them. He pretends to be faithful. He pretends to be a believer. in order to protect his power. We know this about King Herod. I'm still talking about him, by the way. And they come and they tell him. They come and they tell him when they're ordered. They had a choice. And they chose to help Herod, knowing full well what he's capable of. Now, the other thing that I've always wondered is, why did these magi, who read the stars and knew where things were, go to Herod? Why didn't they just go right to where the baby was? Because I think there was something going on there. I think the star guides them right to Herod's house. Because they followed the star all the way there. They observed it as it's rising, and they followed the star to where it guided them. And then notice, as soon as they leave Herod's place, lo and behold, the star guides them to exactly where Jesus was located. Why? Well, I think that was God's intention. God wanted to mess with the Herods of the world. To let him know, to put him on notice. Not give him the exact details, but to put him on notice. Because the star guides them right to where the child is, to the very house. So they weren't lost. They were following the star, and that star went right through the current king. So it was God's intention to let Herod know exactly what was happening, and then to make sure he could do nothing about it. Now, what's interesting in all this is I talk about the various people. When the soldiers came to the town of Bethlehem, started looking for the Christ child, the one that the Magi came to see, you can imagine for a moment some of those folks might have said, "We'll tell you where they went." But nobody tells them where they went. But the folks there were willing to protect those asylum seekers, even at the risk of the lives of the rest of the children, is a powerful witness. I'm still not sure what I do with all of that. But they could have pointed the way and said, "You'll catch up with them. They're riding a donkey and they're on their way to Egypt." But no one in and around Bethlehem says anything. And as a result, these children die. But he might have killed them anyway, just to be sure. Even if they did say that's where he was going. But they don't follow. And then we have the people in Egypt. Notice what they do. They actually welcome the asylum seekers. They don't try to keep them out. Those folks there, too, had a choice. What I'm trying to get at is everybody in this story had a choice. There's no accidents here. No one was acted upon. Everybody had a choice to be faithful, even if they couldn't deal with King Herod directly. Now, what we know about this story and why it's so important as one of the central stories of our faith, as part of the Christmas story, is that it reminds us that this is not the first time that the powerful have sought to kill children to maintain power. If you didn't hear the hints of Moses in the reeds, of Pharaoh who tried to kill all of the babies, all the male children, he was trying to deal with the immigration in his country, keeping the labor costs down and getting rid of the males because they were threatened by this group of folks who weren't like them. That didn't go well for Pharaoh, by the way. It never does. But when Pharaoh issues the order, his own midwives refuse to act. And they're named. Shipra, Puah. They're named. They have names when Pharaoh doesn't. I suppose if you've seen one Pharaoh, you've seen them all. But these two midwives, who worked for Pharaoh, refused to kill the babies on the birthing stools. And they get away with it with one of the greatest jokes ever. They come to him and say, "Well, the Hebrew wives are just more vigorous and they give birth before we get there." They had a choice. They figured it out, they had a choice, and they refused to participate in the ways of empire. I'm getting to something, I think you know where I'm headed, but we're going to get there along the way. What's interesting is that it doesn't stop the killing of the children in Egypt, but the midwives refuse the order, Moses' sister refuses the order, Moses' mother refuses the order, and even Pharaoh's own daughter and all of her servants refuse the order to keep Moses alive. And because Moses is alive, eventually they're all getting out. Every one of them had an opportunity to make a decision. And that's why when we hear the deaths of children in Bethlehem, and we cannot ignore it, we have to recognize that we too have choices to make. It reminds us, I believe this story reminds us, that no matter what happens, we still have a choice when we face the Pharaohs and the Herods of our own day. We may not have control over the Pharaohs or the Herods or be able to change massive policies, but we have a choice to either participate in the ways of empire or refuse to participate. The stories of our faith remind us that our loyalty is not to the ones who wield death, but to the one who rises up new life. Like the Magi, the midwives before them, and all the folks who enabled Moses and Jesus to live. We're not called to collaborate with the ways of death, but we're called to go home by another way, to resist, and to testify to the light that has come into the world. Our resistance will look different for each of us, but none of us is powerless. When God chooses to enter into the world in human form, it's not in a royal palace, and there's no official decree even as creation cries out. The bloodline, even of the child, is suspect. And Nazareth, where the family is currently residing, was a backwater town known for political unrest and bandits. And when the announcement is made to the people, it comes to people employed in professions not thought well of. Shepherds, they were suspect, just like the Magi, and the Nazarites, and the people of Bethlehem. And then a group of people who watch the stars come and worship Jesus in the persons of the Magi. But the crazy thing about this is that on top of this, the title and the announcement of the child's birth is in and of itself seditious. To claim kingship, to proclaim a new king had come, was grounds for execution unless you had an army to back it up. In other words, by the time we get to the story of the killing of the innocent children in this story, we should not be surprised at all. When power is threatened, people die. But God says they don't get the last word in all this. When Herod seeks to uphold his power by killing children or babies, it doesn't give him pause at all. Since the Yemeni war started, some of you might be following this, I think 85,000 children have died, either from casualties of war, lack of food, malnutrition. But it doesn't even show up on the news. We've been at war 17 years. And I had to think, when's the last time I heard about civilian casualties in those war zones? I say that to remind us that if you do any historical work at all, you'll find that people will say, it never happened, the killing of children in Bethlehem. Well, here's the thing about that. Can you imagine a mighty empire killing, which would have probably been about 20 kids, given how many people live there? That an out-of-the-way place, a bunch of kids were killed, and the great empire didn't put it on their evening news. Can't imagine that being the case. But the morality of the empire is always about maintaining power. That is the moral reality. And since that local population could not be trusted to hand over the family and the child from Nazareth, a message had to be sent. Anyone who helps the child will pay a price. Anyone who is not with us is against us. So when God's love then enters the world in the form of a child, God's love, death and destruction is the world's response, and it always will be. So we should not be surprised. The message in Christmas is indeed God's love, but it is also the rejection of that love by the ways of the empire and the death dealers of our day. Here's the thing that makes this so important to share at the end of the Christmas season. If we do not talk about King Herod, if we do not talk about the children, if we do not talk about even John the Baptist, I have to keep bringing him back in, and of course Mary in the midst of this and her revolutionary song, we forget that God entered and enters the world in times and places where life is struggle. When kings rise up and abuse people, when food is scarce and used as a weapon, when love has atrophied and where fear reigns, God is there. These are the places where God acts. God is not waiting to act in the places of our perfection and endless joy. When we face times of uncertainty and trouble, when the authorities of the world act in capricious ways, and when our communities seem to come apart at the seams, that is where the Christmas story is most worked. Christmas, at the end of the day, is not about putting on a happy face, singing carols, and pretending because you don't feel it. Christmas is good news because it comes in bad news time, reminding us that they do not have the last word. And when that really becomes the story we tell of Christmas, it is then that we can sing with a renewed vigor, with a sense of powerful resistance, maybe even tearful resistance, because we know death and sadness do not have the last word. And the death dealers of our day will go the way of Herod. The part I didn't read after that is Herod dies and everything keeps going forward. The world uses Herod as a foil for the rest of time. That's how it works with the Herods of our own time. And when we can come to this realization, when we can begin to embrace this reality, it is then that we can join with others to work for peace and justice without the hope of results. And that's important, because sometimes what we do and our work looks like it's just not making any progress. We don't have to work for the hope of results, because we know those results are in God's hand. And in God's story, it may take a long time, but things do not end in death. When this is the Christmas story that we know, that we tell, that we embody, the end of gifts on this day, the 12th night, is not the end of the joy, but its very beginning. Because we will recognize and see that God is at work, even when all the voices and the stories say otherwise. That's what it means to keep Christmas in our hearts all year.